Good evening. Welcome to our Global Trade and Political Economy. This is Economics 330, of course, City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. Today is Tuesday, October 15th, 2024. It is now actually we're pushing up on 6:06 p.m. And we are now into the formal section of today's lecture. As you may recall, or at least as I hope you will recall, 3 weeks ago, we began a three-part study of the three theoretical perspectives of global trade. Of course, in the intervening 2 weeks, we have focused on the term paper/class project. And now we're getting back on track with our regular course of study. So to reiterate, there are, again, three major perspectives, theoretical perspectives of global trade. These include the liberal perspective, which we, of course, covered 3 weeks ago. Then the realistic perspective, which we're going to cover today, and historical materialism, which we're going to cover next week. This week, we will discuss, of course, realism, because it is distinct from the liberal perspective in that it emphasizes power and the national interest and directs more attention to political security than to economic issues. Recall that the liberal perspective places a lot of bias on international institutions and rules-based international order, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund, and of course, sub-regional trading organizations that supplement the World Trade Organization, as I suspect some of you may have mentioned in your term paper. So first, let's understand get some background on realistic perspective. Realism is actually the oldest school of thought in international relations, or IR. So as you're gonna go through life and class, you're going to hear people mention IR. In this context, it's international relations. Second, classical realism was the dominant approach to international relations for a very long time. Third, realism is an important international political economic perspective today because of the debate about the decline of US economic hegemony vis-a-vis emerging powers such as China, and about the relative merits of government involvement in the markets. So there are really two critical issues that obviously is making a realism perspective very current. This paragraph suggests that obviously between the period between 1989 to the emergence of China as the second largest economy, 1989, of course, will be that inflection point in the global history where the Soviet Union disintegrated, 1989 through 1990, and the Iron Curtain, or the communist bloc in Eastern Europe, began to crumble. And the United States was left as the dominant superpower. Some would say, you might hear this sometimes, that the world went from a bipolar world where there were two polarities of power, United States and the Western Bloc, and Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And then for a moment there, we had a hegemonic US government, US-led international order. Two critical things are happening now. The emergence of China and China's approach to economic growth, which is a lot of state involvement in the markets. And as we go through this paragraph, we're going to see some of the argument from Western countries on how that distorts the global trading system. And of course, the approach to international relations, IR, Some would argue that China and Russia and a number of other authoritarian states, for lack of a better word, tend to be more biased on the realistic perspective rather than the liberal perspective. And we are going to delve into that a little bit. So more recently, government involvement in markets is also the foundation of debate over some countries' reliance on non-market economic practices. I told you guys that every class, there are going to be some phrases, some words that will come up that I wish for you to note it down. These are technical phrases in international trade and global political economy. They suggest a technical level of knowledge and, if not mastery, of the subject. One of those phrases is non-market economic practices, NME for short. So more recently, government involvement in markets is also the foundation of debate over some countries' reliance on non-market economic practices, where international trading partners determine, so this is what non-market economic practices means. When international trading partners determine that a country does not operate on market principles of cost or pricing structures, so that sales of merchandise from such country do not reflect the fair value of the merchandise. As such, state subsidies, which leads to what we know as non-market economic practices. So as such, state subsidies, especially on export products, causes a misalignment between prices and production costs in the global economy. This is bad because it impairs the efficient operation of free market system. One of the things I suspect you may have, some of you may have found as you did some research for your term paper is tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles. The United States and Canada, of course, imposed a 100% tariff. The European Union, I think, has proposed a tariff of up to 43%. Even Brazil, that is, in theory, a strategic ally of China with respect to their membership in BRICS, is proposing a graduated tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles. The argument they make is that the Chinese subsidizes electric vehicle manufacturing in China. And therefore, Chinese which is fine if they're going to sell it in China. China can choose to run an inefficient system within the boundaries of that country. But when you export those cars, you're able to sell them artificially cheaper than the ones made in the countries where you're selling them. So if they were to, for instance, sell them in at least the Department of Commerce, US Department of Commerce would argue that if the Chinese were simply allowed to sell cars that were subsidized in China, here in the United States, that the cars will be priced so cheap that it will price out cars made by GM, Ford, and Stellantis Group, which is, of course, includes Chrysler, Dodge Chrysler's brands. Obviously, this will be bad for employment and tax collection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is why countries place tariff. So as you will recall, we had in a previous class discussed the theory of comparative advantage, which is the ability of a country to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. Comparative advantage is therefore a key economic principle that explains why countries can benefit from trade. That, remember again, if another country can make a good or service more efficiently than you can, you're better off buying it from them and making the things that you have comparative advantage in. That way, the global trading system is sourcing goods and services from its most efficient point. But if one or many of the countries are cheating by using non-economic practices to subsidize goods, then that distorts the price dynamic of the global trading system. So a misalignment between price and production due to non-market economic practices can unduly advantage a country over its trading partners, and worse, distort the efficiency of markets and create inefficiencies in the global trading system. Of note, two major strains of realism are relevant to the study of international political economy. The first strain, which largely neglects economics, seeks little connection between economics and politics. The second strain of realism is more attuned to economic political linkage. And this brings us to our learning objectives for this week. Obviously, each week there's a building block, which you see in your weekly announcement, your learning objectives. Cumulatively, your learning objectives will lead to learning outcomes at the end of the semester. So at the conclusion of this module, you should be able to explain the realistic perspective of international relations. And here are some of the ways I will think about it if I were you. Realists view international relations from a competitive and conflictual perspective. It is usually contrasted with idealism or liberalism, which tends to emphasize cooperation. Not all realists, however, deny the presence of ethics in international relations. A distinction should be drawn between classical realism, represented by such 20th century theorists as Reinhold Niebuhr and Hans Mackentor, and radical extreme realism. While classical realism emphasizes the concept of national interest, it is not the Machiavellian doctrine that anything is justified by reason of state, nor does it involve the glorification of war or conflict. The classical realists do not reject the possibility of moral judgment in international politics. Rather, they are critical of moralism, abstract moral discourse that does not take into account political realities. So you cannot, their argument is that you cannot preach morality in the international system without putting into account the core strategic interest of each individual country, or at least the country engaged in making strategic choices in the international marketplace. Realists believe that sovereign states are the principal actors in the international system, and this is a key distinction. They believe that sovereign states, rather than international institutions, as we've covered previously, including the UN, World Bank, etc., international institutions, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, individuals, and other sub-state or trans-state actors are viewed as having little independent influence. Realists believe that there are no universal principles with which all states may guide their actions. Instead, a state must always be aware of the actions of the states around it and must use a pragmatic approach to resolve problems as they arise. A lack of certainty regarding international intentions prompts mistrust and competition between states. However, realism is often criticized as excessively pessimistic, since it sees the confrontational nature of the international system as inevitable. The second learning outcome is to describe the origins and philosophical foundations of realistic view of international relations. Among its founding fathers, Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes are the names most usually mentioned. 20th century classical realism has today been largely replaced by neorealism, which is an attempt to construct a more scientific approach to the study of international relations. Both classical realism and neorealism have been subjected to criticism from international relations theorists representing liberal, critical, and postmodern perspectives. The third learning outcome is to explain how realism is connected to economic relations and conflict in the global trade, or the global trading system. Realists see the state as motivated by power. So the state in this case is the nation state, not the subnational state, of course. So realists sees the state as being motivated by power. With respect to trade, realists reiterate Machiavelli's philosophies, viewing economic statecraft, including trade policies, as one of the many instruments available to the state in their pursuit of power or national security. We could deep dive the war in Ukraine and how that this is so demonstrative of this line of thinking, but then we might get lost in translation. But if that comes up after class, we'll have that conversation. So moving forward, for realists, trade relationships are temporary, transitory arrangements that can be easily broken when conditions necessitate other strategies to secure national interest. Realist, which is exactly what many would argue that the Chinese are doing, that they joined the World Trade Organization, they understand the rules of the World Trade Organization, but they don't show a lot of respect for the rules of the organization, viewing those rules as transitory or temporary arrangements that can be easily broken when conditions necessitate or other strategies to secure national interest emerge. In this case, the Chinese national interest is to grow its market share, global market share of vehicles, especially electric vehicles. And it is doing so, its trade competitors would argue, by breaking trade rules. Realists do not rule out the utility of force, even against a trade partner, when the national interests are at stake. However, force may be undesirable when trading partner is vital to national interest. Realists are less optimistic about human nature. They envisage conflict rather than cooperation or common good to result from self-interested action. However, each state's pursuit of its own national interest, power maximization, and security produces a dilemma. And this is really important, and this is really the shortcoming in the realistic perspective. If the international relations is devoid of rules, and nations were to simply act in their national interest, and each state were to pursue its own national interest, this is called power maximization and security. This will produce a security dilemma, which in turn results in insecurity and intensifies threats to interstate peace. Here is what I mean by that. When you're Russia and you want to maximize your own utility, and you forgo the international norm, the UN Charter that says no nation shall, through the barrel of a gun, redraw national borders. You show disregard for it, and you march into Ukraine. This will generate a counter reaction. And that counter reaction will produce a security dilemma. And that security dilemma creates quite often greater insecurity and intensifies threat to interstate peace. The security dilemma Russia now faces is that Ukraine now also occupies part of Russia. There are Russians dying, Ukrainians are dying. No two country is safe. This has made the two countries less safe today than they were before Russian invasion. This is the security dilemma that occurs in a realistic perspective when states eschew global norms, international order, and pursue national interest. So this paragraph really summarizes the shortcoming, in my opinion, and most liberalist theorists would also suggest, the shortcoming in the realistic perspective. And this concludes the formal section of this week's lecture. Of course, as I mentioned, next week we will cover the critical perspective in international political economy. And with this, I am going to end the recording, and we could start the informal question and answer section of today's class and office hour. Thank you.